Hello and welcome. As Cecilia said, my name is Mariana, and I'm a member of the GXtest team. That is the tool that will allow us to create and execute tests in GeneXus. We are going to be able to execute tests from GeneXus IDE, and we will also be able to integrate them in a Jenkins scheme. We made a survey in 2016, rather in 2017, and various organizations were interviewed. 63% mentioned testing as a fundamental stage and as a bottleneck. This stage is the one that decelerates our development cycle. So we are going to test you can make the testing more agile. For this purpose, we are going to look at the pyramid of automated testing, as well as the object unit test, the UI test web object, and the UI test object for smart devices. This is a famous pyramid of ideal automated testing. Ideally, in our testing cycle, in our automated cycle, we will be able to have a sound basis of unit tests. These tests will test the components of our system in an isolated manner. Then we are going to have a second layer, which are the integration tests. There we are going to test the integration of several components of our application. And in another layer, we have the interface tests. They simulate the flow of users in the application while the application is being executed. And when we are trying to implement automated testing, the manual tests are going to test only the most complex tests that cannot be automated. That is our idea. GXtests will allow us to implement all these tests of the pyramid. Now, these tests can be achieved with two objects, the unit tests that will be part of our knowledge base and the UI test. So we are going to start by looking at the unit test objects. These objects will make tests with objects that are special GeneXus procedures, with which we will be able to verify the logic of our application. We will be able to verify parameters of procedures values and even the status of our knowledge database. So we will be able to test isolated components, but also test integration in our application. For example, if we want to test a procedure that is calling other procedures, then it would be an integration test. So in order to give you a concrete example, let me show you this test of a procedure, and the object is a special GeneXus procedure that you're going to program in GeneXus code. It's a divide, and in this case, what we want to test is two divide functions. So in this case, we call the procedure in the first case with the values that we want to test, and then through the assertion function, we made a variation, and these are two cases that are being tested. In one case, a divide with a positive number. In the second case, a divide with a negative number. After executing this test, we will be able to see the results in a panel, in a results panel in GeneXus ID. I'm going to do a demo in a moment so that it's more clear. In the results panel, we will be able to see the test results, whether it has been executed successfully or not. If one of the assertions fails, the test will fail. Besides being able to have this object of unit test, we have the possibility of grouping our data, test data, in a data provider. So in this case, we have two test cases grouped in the data provider, and then with the object unit test, we will be able to look at the data provider to see the variations of the data that we have entered. This will allow us to have a set of tests in the data provider under a group. And since it's a special GeneXus procedure, we are going to analyze the data provider and make the variations we want in the procedure. In the same manner, in the results panel, in the IDE, it will be reflected whether the test has passed or failed, depending on the validations that are done with the assertion function, succeeded or failed. So I'm going to make a demo so that this is more clear to you. This is the example I am going to show you. It's going to be also the divide example. So let's say that you have in your KB this divide procedure that divides two numbers. In order to create our unit test, we right-click on the procedure and we select the option Create Unit Test. In this case, there is a template that is generated for the unit test of the function in order to verify the divide function, and we only need to add the data that we want to test. So we right-click on the data provider, we open, and here, as you can see, there are several data that are created at random. And in this case, I'm going to replace it, and I'm going to test two simple cases. So we enter the values that we want to test. In this case, A divided by 2, so the expected result is 5. And then 10 divided minus 2, and the result is -5. So we save the data provider that is going to have this set of data, and in order to run the test, we right-click on the object unit test, and we can run the test. So what's going to happen is that the GXtest is going to process the values that were entered. There are going to be validations with the assertion function. And as you can see, there is a results panel where you can see each test case that we tested. The easy thing about having it in the IDE is that the developer, after making a change, can test its set of unit tests and have an early feedback about the status of the application before doing a commit. Besides this, instead of having word panels with a set of data, of having auxiliary procedures that verify the application and show the results in the console, it is directly in the IDE and can be used in order to set a design of the testing of the application, being able afterwards to implement quickly from the IDE, as I showed you with a right-click, Create Unit Test. You will be able to create on the procedures. So these templates will be generated, and you will be able to test any object that you want to verify in a programmatic manner, because this is a special GeneXus procedure. And as I said, in this case, we are testing an outgoing parameter of the divide procedure, the parameter result. But we can also do variations in the status of the database. If we have a procedure that sets values in the database, we will be able to travel all the tables of the database and do assertions on these values. So we have these two options with a unit test. I wanted to show you simple examples. We're not going to see examples from the database, but if you are developers, you know that you have to add a for on one of the tables and make an assertion on the fields that we want to verify. Now let us look at the UI test object. The UI test, as I said, as an object, and the user interface test are going to simulate the flow of the user on the application. For this purpose, we also have the object UI test for web and also the UI test for smart devices that is going to be analog but for smart devices. Now we are going to see another demo so that this is more clear for you. But to give you an idea, the unit test object has a variable, which is a driver, which is defined, and it is also a special GeneXus procedure, and it has a defined driver, and through this variable driver, we will have commands available to execute actions on the browser. So here what we do is that we have the typical commands like open the application that we want to test, which we do with the command go, and then we have commands in order to simulate the click and enter data, and we will have commands to do everything the user does. We have commands that simulate the flow that the user is going to do on the application. And in the same panel results, when we execute them, they are going to be showed. And the test is going to see whether all the commands are executed successfully. If that's not the case, the test will fail. These commands will carry out actions on the applications while it runs in the browser. So I'm going to show you a demo. Imagine that starting to create these interface tests is not so simple. When you want to take an object and codify it manually, it would take a long time. That is why we have a Chrome extension, which is the GX recorder. And while we execute the application, we are able to have a user flow and register all the steps that the user takes, and then we are going to import that test to GeneXus IDE, and then we are going to have this code. So I will show you in the demo how to do it. The application that we are going to test is this one, which simulates a business courier. So what we do here is manage customs containers and their respective boxes. So what I'm going to do is to record a flow, create a box, set the cost for the box, then eliminate the box and reproduce the flow from GeneXus ID. So I have already downloaded the recorder, and you can download it from Google's MarketSpace. And I'm going to start recording the test, clicking on the record button. What I'm going to do is that while the application is running, I'm going to simulate the flow that the user of the application would make. So I'm going here to the boxes, insert a box. I complete the data, the information that is requested on the screen. Sorry, it is not recording. Yes, it is recording, she says. As you can see, in this case, all the commands that are executed are recorded. It's the user that is executing the commands on the application. It should be clicking when it is recording, but it seems that it's in pause and it's not recording. So I'm going to start recording again. So I'm going to start again. I'm going to add a box, that I'm going to set the cost of the box, and I'm going to eliminate it. So I'm going to add a box with some parameters like the weight and some other parameters from a list. The cost is going to be assigned to the box, and I continue completing the relevant information. In this case, it's going to be in container number 1. So I confirm, and I go to container 1, and here I'm going to set the cost of the boxes. And I'm going to eliminate the box. This is one of the main flows of the application. I'm going to validate that the cost has been assigned to the box, since zero cost would be a problem for us. And this is the validation we have to make, that the cost has been assigned. And finally, I'm going to eliminate the box. So we have a list of commands that the recorder has been capturing while the user is browsing on the application. It can be reproduced from here, from the recorder, to verify that this is actually the flow that we want to test, and verify that it is reproduced. So we hope that it will be reproduced correctly, and here the cost is set, it is validated, and the box is eliminated. Now that we have validated that this is a test we want to make, we click on this button and it downloads a file with the GeneXus code. So I copy the code and I'm going to create an object in my KB. We have to create an object here, UI test for web. I get the code, and we are going to have our first interface test in our IDE in order to be able to test it. Interface tests can be run as well as unit tests from the IDE, or they can be integrated to a Jenkins and let them run unattended. But you will see here in the results panel how the results are deployed. So we right-click on Run this test. And you will see how the browser opens. And the idea is that this test is reproduced automatically. You see here how the browser opens. It says at the top that it is being managed automatically, and the flow that we recorded previously is reproduced. This tool will allow you to start managing these objects. You will be able to record your tests, and then when you take them to the IDE, you will have a notion of what is the GeneXus code. And besides, with the documentation you have in the wiki, you will be able to edit the code, and you can add other commands that you may need. In this case, the test has been successful because all of the commands were executed successfully, and we have validated that the cost has actually been assigned to the box, which is what we wanted to verify. These kind of tests are typically used in order to make regression tests and also to make tests about the main flows of our business. Ideally, these tests are not run from the IDE, although for some developers it may be interesting to run the most important flows they have been modifying. But the ideal scheme is that this is run unattendedly in a Jenkins, in a continuous integration system. Finally, we have also the interface tests for smart devices, which are very similar to the web tests. They also have an app variable, app in this case, with commands that are different from the web commands, but they function in the same way. And the actions that we want to reproduce on our smart device will be coded for the purpose of the test. And I'm going to show you now a video on what the execution would be like in an interface test in a smart device. In this case, this is the test that is going to be executed. And in the video, the run this test was already done. So you see how the test is being executed, and you will see in the iPhone how it is reproduced. This is supported at the moment for iOS, and it's going to be developed also for Android. Right now, it has been released in beta for iOS. What we do is add a container. And in the same manner, you see here the results of the test in the results panel. So as I was telling you, the main purpose is to integrate these tests in a continuous integration process in order to resolve the bottleneck that has been identified as a problem in our development cycle. I want to show you the case of a model of continuous integration, which would be like the basic sequence of continuous integration. But you can also run other tests like performance or static code tests. In this case, after we do the build, we would run the unit tests, that is to say the unit test objects, which are the ones that validate the components of our AKB and are going to give us the results of validating that the procedures, the business components, and the objects of our AKB function as we would want. Then you can do a deploy to a testing environment, and there you can run the interface tests. This does not necessarily have to be like this. There are development teams that could very well run the unit tests without doing a deploy. But this is the purpose, to have a testing environment where you can run the interface tests, and then you can notify the results to the interested parties. And you can go one step further, which targets the continuous delivery, but in an environment, in a production environment. So this was my presentation, and after Fabian presents the other part, you can ask us questions if you have any doubts.
No sé si quedaron. Pero claro, para las dudas vos te tenés que poner un micrófono. Así que pedirles que te pongan.
Bien, ahora para ir finalizando.
To conclude then our part of debate, I'm going to be talking about deployment. In the first place, I'd like to say what GeneXus offers, what GeneXus 16 offers in order to help you in deployment. and also see how we can integrate that into Jenkins to have the entire cycle. GeneXus offers three things. On the one hand, we have the deployment unit object. Before everything, is anyone using deployment as a tool? Yes, you are. Sebas? Yes. So we have the deployment unit object, which is an object of our KB, which where we'll indicate what is it that we're going to deploy. Then we have the deployment tool, which is where we're going to indicate where we're going to deploy and where. And then we have MS Build tasks, which allow us to automate these actions and to integrate Jenkins, for instance, all the deployment tasks. So let's start with the deployment unit object. This is a new object, which already been created and controlled, like any other object, and it's going to be kept under preference, where we've got the environment, where we've got the data store. Then we have deployment unit there. The use is quite simple. What we're going to do is to list the objects that we want to deploy together. This is a deployment unit. In our KB, we're going to have many objects or even many applications, or we may have different components that may be deployed differently. And so we're going to have a deployment unit for each one of those units. The deployment unit is a list of objects then, where we're going to include main objects. We can include file objects, or we can include business process diagrams. In fact, the idea is to indicate that, well, you want to deploy this application, then we're going to see that the deployment tool will determine everything that the package has. Now, as I said, we're going to have in our KB, we're going to have all the units, all the deployment units. What you can see there on the screen is an example. We use this entire Jenkins scheme for the applications in this for this event. It's a KB that is public, but you have the web application, the mobile applications. We have chatbot services, all the procedures sending out notices, and so on. So we created different deployment units for each one of those components. Some of them deploy to a certain type of server, and others do it to other servers. We've structured it in that way. And once we have the deployment unit, what we have to do is to carry out an action on the deployment unit. We can do build or rebuild of a deployment unit, of the objects that are included there. You'll build everything that is necessary. And the third action is deploy application. And there we are truly going to deploy to the server. And that's where the deployment tool comes in. We've already defined what we're going to deploy. Now we're going to define how and where. Now, to open the deployment tool, we can carry out that action, deployed application in the deployment unit, or we go to GeneXus menu, and we'll have an option which is deploy application, and that will open the deployment tool. And here the work is extremely easy. First of all, we have to indicate what is it that we want to deploy. On the left-hand side, you see a combo with the deployment units. You'll select the one you want, and you can even add another object if you want. And so you have a list of the objects that need to be deployed. And we're going to say, well, where we're going to make that deployment. To that end, you have those options below. You have the target and the application server. that varies depending on whether we are working with Java or not, and these are the options. On the left-hand side, you have Java. On the other one, you have Java. You can do it for Docker, SAP. You have all those options. It could be mixture. And you have this application server, which, well, we needn't, we don't have to do it everywhere, but this is for the deployment tool to create the correct applications and works XML and so on, because the deployment tool is not only setting up a package, but also setting up the file configurations that are the configuration files that are necessary. For instance, if we need to make a Lambda deployment, then you need a server file .config. So the deployment tool generates this automatically. We needn't worry about how to create the entire configuration. So what we're going to obtain in the deployment tool is the full package of what we need to send to the server. Now, when we indicate where we're going to deploy it, we have actions, we have option actions to where we're going to deploy it. For instance, when we make a local deployment, we simply have to make up the package. But if it's a deployment to Beanstalk, then you have to configure the credentials, region, name of application. The idea is not to explain this to you. This is particular things about Amazon. But if you choose Azure or Lambda, this is going to change. You have to indicate those properties. And then once you have all this configured, you go to, you tick on the deploy, and you send the package to the server that you've indicated. Now, many times, all right, this would be the output of the deployment action. This is a typical output of a deploy towards Amazon Mixed. I'm going to talk about one of these things in more detail later. But what I'd like to say is that many times we need, in that deployment, we need some further files, and you can add them manually, configuring this file user.gxd where you can indicate that other files or full folders are taken and say where in the application that's going to be found. This, although the deployment tool is intelligent enough to know everything for each app, it may happen that a resource must be added manually. So we configure that, and we're going to configure, and we're going to generate packages with all the files that we need. Very well. You've seen here that this is quite easy. Tasks are quite easy. The tool itself provides us a lot of facilities, but we can also automate the use of those tasks, of those tools, through MS Build tasks. Jose explained to you what MS Build tasks are early this morning. I'm going to be mentioning now some tasks that come in with GeneXus that may be used to automate these processes. Let me go back to the output screen, because what I'd like to say is that the deploy, when executed, I mean, when the entire deploy tasks are made, well, the first task that is carried out is that you create a deploy project in GeneXus with all the information of the application that we must deploy. Then on the basis of that project that was created, you create a package that we have to send to the server, and there you run the KB depending on what the project defines, and you would add all the necessary files. also including if you the one you've added, as I said. And then the last task is to send it to the corresponding server. Task number 3, if you are only doing the one, doesn't execute. And then we have an MS build task for each one of them. Now, something I haven't mentioned yet is that in our deployment unit, we added main objects, and we needn't worry, and that's one of the important things, we needn't worry about what should be included in the one, that is, to add anything, because all that intelligence is in the implement tool. For instance, let me give you an example. The application of this event is an offline application, but it calls certain screens that use online services. So by adding the main object, the implement tool knows how to go all along the call tree. Since it's offline, there are many procedures that are not generated in Java to run the video, but there are others, for instance, synchronization and others. So all that is created automatically and is added to the package that will be developed. So going back here, what you have to do then is to carry out these 3 tasks. In fact, in the practical course, we're going to see how to make this deploy with MS Build of what you did in the previous practical course. So the first thing is to create the project, and you do it with a file called deploy.msbuild, which is in GeneXus installation, and with several parameters where you have the path, the project name, the object that we're going to deploy, and this is, we're going to go to the deployment unit, and we could put names of objects, web panels, S panels, and so on. And then environment. Now, what's the output of this? Is there is a file which is .gxdproj with all the information in the file. It's an MS Build format that you have in that file, and that's the one we have to look into in the second part. That is, the second task in MS Build will be done with the file that we generated in the previous task. In that case, we're going to create a package, and this will generate whatever it is. That's the name. After that, after we have the WAR, we have to send it to the server. We can do it manually, or we can use the MS Build and send it to the deployment target that we may need. In GeneXus application, you'll see that there is a deployment target folder, and those are the actions that you had in the combo, lambda, okay, SCP, etc. And each one of them has a file of deploying MS Build with particular parameters for each one of those platforms. Now, those parameters are the ones that were, you remember the options I showed you? Well, that's that. And we're indicating it here. That is, all the tasks and all the actions that we were doing with the IDB of GeneXus with implement tool, we can automate it with these 3 MS Build tasks. And now, we have the capacity to do that and to integrate it in Jenkins in all our continuous integration scheme. This is just an example of how to configure that. We're going to do it now in the practical course. As much as in Jenkins, we could add build steps, and we chose build from GeneXus KB. The other one is to execute an MS Build, and you say execute this file with these parameters, and that's what we're going to do. This image, you can't read it, I know, but this is the way we've configured the deploy, for instance, of the event apps. The first is the first task of the project, the second one is the WAR, and the third is seen to view. You're going to do this on your own in a minute. So that is everything related to deployment. So we are at your disposal should you need anything. Yes, my question is about unit tests of a smart device. How do you automate that in a window? You do it with the emulator. How do you execute interface mobile tests? Well, Germán is going to answer that because it's more technical. Well, the smart device tests, as well as for web tests, can be automated. That's what we are talking, and we didn't have a possibility of commenting on that. The execution of the test, whether it's in unit or interface, there are also MS-built tasks as much as for deploy. There are others that you may run it there, and the configuration in that particular case is read from the KB. I mean, the KB has configured in its environment what device and what version of the iOS is going to be used. I understand, but in the case of web interface, have you got a Chrome installed in the same machine? But suppose you've got an integration machine, you should have a Mac running devirtualized somewhere. That's what I don't understand. For the emulator, because you said it was for mobile, and for, well, in that case, you would have to configure the infrastructure that's necessary. If it's a Mac, well, and the emulator that you'll be using to make the deploy of the application of the smart device and also the execution of the test. But then that would mean that I would have my own integration environment locally. I won't be able to integrate it in the cloud because I can't virtualize an SD. Yes, right. I understand. Good morning. Let's suppose you've got a process, and that process calls another process. In a unit test, can you call another unit test? Yes. Tests are procedures, and they may call one another or call any other function or process that you could call a common GeneXus procedure. So let's suppose I have two processes, and each one has, A calls B, and if I run the unitary test of A, it's going to call B. All right. Any further questions about tests or deployment? Well, it's not a question really, but in the output of GeneXus, when you make a deploy, when you deploy some of the tasks, and when you create the deploy, you are creating an MS build task. We could underscore or say that that task has been executed so that the output is not that linear. Put it in red or mark it, highlight it somehow. Well, I haven't mentioned it, but the deploy output is another window. You have the build, the general, and then you have one that is deployed. Now, but what I mean is, in the text, while you're saying what you're doing, to mark which files of the tasks that you have is running, simply for visualization purposes. Yes, Siva would like to say something. Just to comment that we used to have it at the beginning, and it was too verbal, too verbose, it was an enormous log in general, that wouldn't contribute much to that window output, which is just this. If you put in a list of giant files, wasn't much useful, but with MS-Build and the commands that Fabian mentioned, you can change the verbosity level, and you can have the full list of what the MS-Build is copying at that precise time. To say that if I modify MS-Build, and I'm going to have the output that we are giving, right? I think that what he says is that to determine which of the three steps you are, I mean, that was my first intention, to know in which of the steps I'm in. But then after what you said, so it means that I dug my own grave. That's what you mean? Well, but when you've got a problem, you know that if you change the tasks file, you can change the GeneXus output. Well, every single step indicates where you are going and what tasks it's carrying out. And perhaps it's not that clear, but once you know it, the execution of the second step is copying the themes and the resources, and it's telling you what it's doing on that list. If there is a failure there in a file, then it's going to tell you what file failed, either because it wasn't there or because you are copying it and it's on the other side as well. But it gives you information for that particular file that failed. It doesn't show you the entire list. Well, in the MS-Build output, you have it in Jenkins. The output isn't the one that you get in GeneXus, but it's more detailed. Right, but in the log that you've got in Jenkins, I mean, that same detail I could have it in GeneXus. Yes, you could. We've taken out on purpose, but you could, yes. I'm thinking that you could, but you can't configure it now. We could put in something for you to configure it and increase the level of verbosity precisely for that purpose. Well, it's a line per file added by the word, so it's a gigantic thing that perhaps doesn't contribute much. That's how we thought it out, yes. It's a line per file, but there are many processes that are run to change or to change the encrypting key or many other processes that are run and to give you a full detail of each one. Well, what it happens now is that they give you in what step you are, and if something fails, it would mark it. If you go too deep into details, well, we thought it wasn't really doing anything better. Well, no, I understand that there is a certain degree of detail, but we know that things fail sometimes, and when things fail, well, there should be an easy way of knowing where you are. All right, the easy way to get out, it's twofold. On the one hand, when GeneXus fails, it tells you what step was taken and why it failed. If I can't solve the problem with that information, I would go to GeneXus log, and that's where the MS-Build is there, and because that one was executed, and I can change the verbosity afterwards, and I can it shows how I wandered away and what's happening. Yes, we could change that GeneXus verbosity and have the same thing. Yeah, all right, I understand. I mean, there is a technique. All right, it's valid, yes. I've got a question about previous versions from 15 to 16. The deploy tools, are you using the same one as a standalone tool, or is it out of date, the same way as tests that you were using another tool? Is that obsolete? Well, GeneXus 15 you could install and add the module of XT, and you could use it. Now, I don't know if there's any details about 15. I'd like to say, well, the previous version is the one that was going to be obsolete. And what about the deploy 2? Well, in the latest upgrades of version 15 was there. For instance, for GitHub, there wasn't one. It was an external one. We have a deployment wizard from Java, and that too was something new to encapsulate everything there and replace all those tools, which were quite old, and it didn't consider many new things like REST services. Many things had to be done manually, so that's disappeared. Now everything that you were doing there, you can do it in here as well. Well, I let everyone take the floor first, but that it is obsolete doesn't mean that when I migrate my KB, everything is migrating. It's not that I have to start from scratch, right? Well, there is a test. The unit test couldn't be run. Well, so I'm up to date. Well, up to version 3.0, you could make tests of the interface only. At the application level, I mean, not unit tests. But as from GXT, it goes on being developed in version 4, and for 15 UI, which we know it works with various previous versions. We started developing it, and tests are kept. If you migrate from 15 to 16, it would work out. It's compatible.